Welcome to the My Jesus Story podcast. I'm Kim.
I'm Kristen.
And today we have Greg.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Welcome. I'm excited to hear your story.
I'm glad to share it with y'all.
Awesome. Have you ever experienced a time in your life where you knew God had done something or was up to something?
Pretty much throughout my whole entire life. I remember one example that kind of comes to mind is when I was 19. I got saved at a pretty young age, but when I was a teenager, I didn't read my Bible as regularly as I should. But God really worked on me when I was 19. I kind of struggled with unforgiveness toward somebody who'd kind of done a lot of wrong to my family, and I kind of made a lot of excuses about it. I was generally pretty good about forgiving people. At least I felt like I was, but I kind of made excuses to not forgive this person. And I just happened to pray one day, God, if there's anything in my life that's not right, show me what it is. And he did. He showed me through a church service. The preacher got up and said he was preaching on unforgiveness. And I felt like he came down and slapped me right in the face and said, listen up. And so, God really got a hold of me with that. And he really just completely cleansed my mind of that unforgiveness. And I remember in the months following that, I just started digging in my Bible more and studying every day on it. And it kind of just blossomed into more, deeper study of God's word. And that encouraged me to grow more. So there have been many times he's been up to something in my life, but that's kind of a big one that comes to mind.
That's well, first of all, the forethought of, is there anything in me that needs, would you say, cleansing?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. That's a good one. And so unforgiveness, you care, not so much details, but get into a little bit of bitterness. Did you have like the bitterness and the, anger? And then when you threw it over to God, what flipped in your life?
Well, I did have a lot of anger, and, I felt like, this person had done something really horrible and everything. And I remember specifically kind of when the flip happened was after the sermon was over, because I felt like that preacher was just talking to me the whole entire time. And I remember I got down and prayed at the end of the service during altar call. And I said, okay, God, I understand now I need to forgive this person, but I don't know how. How am I going to do it? Tell me something that's going to help me forgive this person. And it was almost like, God leaned down and whispered in my ear, what if when you asked me to save you, I said, no, you aren't good enough. And I tell you, I felt it was like a wind just blew through me from the top of my head down to my feet. And I just sobbed and sobbed. And I remember when I stood up from that, it was like just supernaturally gone.
Wow.
And, I wrestled a lot with this. Like I said, I knew that, deep down I needed to forgive this person, and, but my flesh didn't want to. But ultimately, I felt like God said, if you're going to serve me, you need to get rid of this. And I praise him that he gave me the strength to be able to get through that.
Wow. That's why I love doing this. I know that's going to help somebody. That's really good. That's really good. So have you known Jesus your whole life?
Yeah, I was raised in church. My mom and dad went to church together, and they started taking me to church from the time I was born, basically. And my testimony really starts when I was born. And I remember growing up, going to church as early as I can remember. And my grandma was a big part of my life. My dad's mom, I called her Nana. And so my mom and dad and Nana would constantly talk to me about Christ. And I remember when I was 7 years old, Nana was over at my house, and I said, Nana, how do you get to heaven? And I said, do you just have to be a good person? Because of course, as a little kid, I didn't perfectly understand everything. And she said, no, you have to get saved. And she explained that to me. And she talked about reaching out to God in prayer and basically repenting and accepting Christ. And I didn't do it in that moment, but I remember there was one day I was just out somewhere with my mom, and I was a kid that, like, even I would say probably as young as like 6 years old, I would have these thoughts of like, if I had done something I knew was wrong, it would really bother me, even if, nobody else knew about it. And, there's a lot of kids that if nobody's around, it's like, hey, I got away with it, I guess. But that never really sit well with me. I always had this feeling of like something's off and it's got to be made right somehow. And so when Nana told me that, it just really resonated with me. And there was one day, like I said, I was out with my mom, and I just had this kind of impressment in my spirit of now's the time. And I prayed that prayer, accepting Christ and repenting. And I just felt like this wave of, it's like, just new is the best way I can describe it.
That's really cool. So at 7, is that what you
Yep,
said?
7 years old.
Out in public.
Yeah, I was in the car with my
Okay.
mom. We was driving home from somewhere. We had kind of been out shopping,
Yeah.
and it was on the way back.
Yeah. So didn't have to be in church.
Yeah,
Didn't have to be, it's between you and him wherever you do it.
yeah.
That's cool. So you're wearing Gospel with Greg hat and Gospel with Greg t-shirt.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
So Gospel with Greg is a YouTube series that I do. This around this time that we're recording this makes 5 years I've been doing it. I started it in January of 2021, and I had a YouTube channel that I created when I was 14, and I posted other kinds of stuff on there for many, many years. But Gospel with Greg is something I started, like I said, about 5 years ago. And I didn't even intend it to be a series, but so it's basically, it's sort of like a podcast that I do just on different Bible themes, or just different aspects of Christianity, like breaking down different Christian teachings and how to apply them, also defending the faith, different things like that. There's kind of a whole, wide range of different topics I cover. And so that's kind of the essence of it.
That's cool. Do you have a favorite topic?
Well, there are a few different things that kind of stick out to me, of things I like to particularly talk about, although I really enjoy talking about anything to do with God's Word. But one thing I particularly like is I have a history background, couple history degrees, and I actually teach history for my job. And so I've done a few videos where I've tied that in. So particularly, I've done some videos on like historical evidence for Christianity. A lot of people don't know this, but there are actually several sources that talk about Jesus and things like his crucifixion outside of the Bible. So like even some sources written by people who were enemies of Christianity that'll write about Jesus' crucifixion and different things like that. And so I've explored different things like that. And so that's kind of one of my favorite things to talk about.
I love that. I mean, because so many people see Jesus as a fictional character, like he didn't walk the earth. And there's so many places outside the Bible, yeah, a lot of people agreed that he was here. Not everybody agrees that he was the Christ, but lots of people believe that he was a prophet, things like that. So, do you have a favorite biblical character, or like a story, like somebody who, Noah, for example? Noah's obedience to me is remarkable. So something like that.
I would say for me, aside from Jesus, I would say Paul. And there are a couple different reasons for it. One is when you read Paul's letters, he suffered a lot of persecution. And I mean, all of the disciples did. But, we see him in prison. He even wrote some of the books of the Bible in prison, and beaten with rods and all these other things. But if he didn't tell you that, you would never guess it, because there's just so much joy in his writings, and just this amazing, like a supernatural joy, and despite his circumstance. And that's really challenged me as I've studied Paul's writings more and more. I think especially in, a first world country like the United States, we have so many luxuries, running water, and many of us have a home to live in and food and all that, and we don't have to worry about these things, but we can get so upset about different things. And, and sometimes it can be really trivial things too. But then I, will remember things that Paul wrote about how much joy he had when he had basically nothing in an earthly sense, but it was because spiritually he had everything. And so that's really challenged me, over the last several years, especially, when I get upset about things, to think about how blessed I really am in the grand scheme of things. And so that's one big reason Paul sticks out to me. But there's actually something else about Paul that actually inspired the Gospel with Greg series. One of his writings, and a lot of people, when it comes to like singleness in the Bible, when a lot of people think of that, I think a lot of people think of Paul. And so, like when I first started Gospel with Greg, my first video was on singleness. So kind of like being single and being a Christian. And so I was 22 when I started Gospel with Greg, and I had never really dated or anything like that. And I'm 27 now, and I still really haven't. But I kind of felt like a lot of what our society says about singleness just really didn't resonate with me very well. And like, I feel like even a lot of people in the church, even though, especially more traditional churches might be right that, God created marriage and it can be a blessing and all that. I think a lot of people have this mentality of like, it's just so sad to be single and, all that kind of stuff. But, so for a long time, I kind of looked at, what's the right way to look at this? Because I kind of went to the other extreme where I was kind of cynical towards, romantic relationships. But I was reading in my Bible one day in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I came across verses 32 through 35 where Paul talked about how single people can focus more on how they can please God and then the responsibilities of, those who are married. And I studied, other aspects of the Bible's teachings on that too. But I remember that really hit me. And I thought, this is exactly what I've been looking for in terms of like the right way to look at this. But I would watch a lot of Christian channels, and when they would talk about the subject of singleness, all they would talk about, just keep praying, God will send you somebody one day. And I'm like, why doesn't anybody ever mention any of these, passages? And finally, I kept kind of thinking like, somebody needs to say this, somebody needs to say this. And I eventually thought, fine, I'll do it. And so I did my first video on that. Didn't plan for it to be a series, but I kind of felt God, plant more things in my mind if there's other things to talk about, and it kind of just took off from there.
You are the first person to talk about that, and I'm so happy to hear you say that. I feel like American culture sometimes puts pressure on single people to find a mate, and when it's time, you'll get one or not. But that's God's thing, and man, that makes me happy to hear you say that.
Have you ever experienced a time of brokenness that you found God there with you?
Yes, definitely. So one thing that comes to mind is, so I've struggled a lot with mental health issues throughout my life. Ever since I was a small child, I've struggled with anxiety issues. And I found out when I was 16, I have obsessive compulsive disorder. And that's something that a lot of people in our society kind of cliche and like joke about and everything, but it can be really debilitating. And, just a lot of anxieties involved with it. And, I've had times in the past where like even just simple day-to-day life things could feel really overwhelming, even if I didn't show it to a lot of people. Like if I didn't eat a meal within a certain time, like tried to eat breakfast after 10 a.m., it would cause like a lot of anxiety, or, would be like really afraid of germs and all that. And, just other different things. And, would constantly have this fear that like I was messing something up, just like anything I was involved with, that, I was going to cause some huge problem and it was going to lead to this catastrophe. And, I had times where I would go through seasonal depression too. From the time I was probably about 18 to 22 or so, I would get that every year, seasonal depression, and the anxiety would become like unbearable during that time. And there would be times where like I didn't want to live anymore, and where I felt like I was nearly going to go insane. And I remember the last year I ever got um, seasonal depression. It was so amazing. Even though it started off very unpleasant, God worked an amazing miracle. And and during those times, even though it was unpleasant, I found that it drew me to pray even more. Even if I had prayed every day already, I felt like I was constantly praying all day long and everything. And I think that's actually a good thing that came from it. But I found that, like, when it came to the anxious thoughts, I would pray that God would take them from me. But as soon as I was done praying, I'd want to go back to debating them. And I remember there was one day where I just felt exhausted, like just physically and everything. And I remember just saying a prayer to God, and it felt like it took the last little bit of energy I had to get this prayer out. And I basically said something to the effect of something really simple like, God help me. And I remember as soon as I prayed that, I just felt the Spirit of God so strong on me. And I felt like just in waves, like my energy came back more and more. And I remember that prayer got so effortless because it felt, like I said, it felt like it took all my energy to just say those few words I said. But it got so effortless to the point like where, I didn't even have to try to talk when I was praying and everything. And I had never spoken in tongues before, never prayed in tongues before that, but that ended up happening. And I remember after I was done praying that prayer, I just felt, like God had touched me so much. And, it just, as you can imagine, that, kind of boosted my mood quite a bit. And I remember going and telling my mom about it, and I was so excited. And, I felt more awake and everything, but I went to tell my mom because she knew what I was going through. And I started to tell her, and I just broke down in tears as I was telling her. And I never had seasonal depression again after that year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So all of that happened within a half-hour period of time. Let me back up. The prayer where you had a hard time just getting out the words to going and talking to your mom. That all happened within a short time frame.
Yeah, probably within just a few minutes,
Okay.
honestly.
Wow. And then the speaking in tongues too.
Yeah.
Do you still?
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah, sometimes when I pray, yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't understand that, so so I've never. That's not anything I'm familiar with, but I'm fascinated by it. So cool. Um, do you care to get into a little bit more talking to God about like what your prayer was like when you're chatting with Him? Are you talking out loud? Are you quietly in your mind when you're asking for like deep help for something like that?
In that specific situation, I felt like it kind of started with, I was praying out loud, but it was like in a whisper. And I would say, in general, I kind of do that too. Or sometimes I even just pray inside my mind to God. And I know that He's powerful enough to hear it and everything. And so sometimes, like if I'm in those situations where, things feel really dire, it might become more expressive and everything.
I love this. I just love learning. I'm still kind of, like Jesus newbie. I feel like everybody can learn from other people's experiences. Man, I love hearing stories. Do you have a hope right now or a peace right now that keeps you moving forward? Do you ever try to take back that anxiety from God? Like, does it ever seep in and without knowing you start and entertaining it a little bit, or are you like, nope, I'm done with that. I threw you out years ago.
I feel like I go through times where I still, like, my anxiety might heighten a little bit, but it's never been as bad as it was then, because after that, when I was delivered from that seasonal depression, I would say the worst part of my OCD symptoms diminished. And so I still do struggle with it some, but it's not nearly as bad as it was. And like I said, even though it does spike sometimes, particularly if I'm going through a really stressful time in life, I would say that I don't ever really fully go back to how I was then, and I'm happy to leave it there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And you feel like, in that moment, God delivered you from that.
Yeah.
I love that.
What is your advice for someone in a low like that right now?
So for somebody going through something like that, I would say the most basic thing you can do is pray to God and pray to God regularly. And, it sounds really simple. And, a lot of people, especially if it's a really dire situation like that, they might have this feeling of, I want to fix now, I want to get through this now. And certainly God can do that. Like I said, God's done amazing miracles like that for me. But I think that, we get this temptation a little too much of, I want to get, a complete fix right now. And we might even put the pressure on ourselves of like, fixing ourselves. And I think that people, when they do that, they sort of put an impossible task on their self of, and like I can tell you for me personally, as a teenager, if somebody was to try to tell me, to be patient or, different things like that, when I was struggling with those things, I would kind of get frustrated, even if I knew they were right, because I would kind of have this mentality of like, I can't fix it all at once and all these things like that. But I think that somebody in that situation, something they should really grab a hold of is, yes, it can be really tough and it can be frustrating to have to go through these things, but you don't have to fix yourself. And even if you would prefer a certain timing for it, God has a perfect will and a perfect plan. And all you really need to do is not fix yourself, so to speak, but allow God to fix you, to take that first step. And I mean, think of all the different things that we hang in there for, even when we get tired of waiting. And so if we're willing to hang in there for those things, how much more should we be willing to hang in there for God?
I think that's kind of human nature that we want to try to fix ourselves, when really we should just be turning it over to God to let Him fix it and take our hands off of it, because we'll make a mess of things if we don't. How do you tell between your will and God's will?
Well, if it ends bad, I know it was mine. So that's one thing. But, I would say really when it comes to it, a big thing is what is going to truly, further the kingdom of God and enable me to be a better servant of God. Because let me tell you, I've had times in my life where I have had to do things I did not want to do. And, like maybe give up something I didn't want to give up, maybe move away from somewhere I liked and everything. And I'm like, this is so difficult. And, you know, it's one of those things that, my will was to stay where I was or, to go somewhere else or these different things. But, when I really sought God in prayer and really thought about, what is going to enable me to be the best servant of God if I'm obedient, I know that that's the will of God. And, because I've had times where, I've had to face difficult decisions of what to do. And, like I lived in Tennessee for a few years and I absolutely loved it down there, but I ended up moving back to Ohio after a few years. And no shade on Ohio, but I wanted to stay in Tennessee just because I loved it. But it was one of those things where, my will was to stay down there, but there were some things about coming back here that I could see that were great ministry opportunities and great opportunities to witness to people. And when I was really honest with myself, I had to admit that this is the will of God and I need to, put my plan aside. And, we might make the best decisions, and we don't always make the best decisions with the best judgment. But I think even when we do try to make the best decisions, sometimes we don't know enough to make the best choice, even if we're trying to, but God knows everything. And so I think that's a big reason of why sometimes God might call us to do something where we're like, what? And it's one of those things where it's like, if you just knew everything God did, it would make perfect sense.
Did you have peace? Because the will of God is something that comes up a lot, especially for, well, anybody really. I was going to say people who are kind of new to the faith, but anybody. You always want to try and stay in step with Him. You want to live inside His will. So when you were in Tennessee and it was looking like you were going to come back to Ohio, were you thinking, man, I don't want to do this, but I have peace about it? What is it that sits in your soul, I guess, that made you certain that that was what you were supposed to do?
Well, I would say that toward the very end, even though I had strong kind of human emotional feelings about it, I would say that spiritually I was sure that it was the right thing to do. And it was just one of those things that, you know, for one thing, prayer was a part of it. But I remember, I tried to stay there and everything and look at, different options to try to stay there. And it seemed like for a little while, every time I went to church, the preacher preached on Jonah trying to flee. And I'm like, they're talking to me. They're talking about me. And so, and I kind of just knew that was the point. So I was kind of like, all right, God, I have my preferences, but I don't want to rebel. So, help me get over those feelings. But, also too, like I said, there were ministry things and opportunities to witness that when I really thought about those, I kind of just had this, I feel like I did have, like spiritually have a peace about it.
Mm-hmm. Did you start your podcast while you were down there?
I started it when I was in the process of moving down there. So I hadn't fully moved down yet, but I was kind of in the middle of moving.
Okay. That just hit me. Timing sometimes is interesting to me. I don't know. Do you have any other stories for people where you kind of know that God was nudging you to do something that maybe you didn't want to do, or you got confirmation like, yes, I have been wanting to do this. And he just kind of confirmed that, yeah, this is the direction. You're on the right path. Put you on the spot. Sorry.
It's all right. So there have been other times where God has really, I felt like put something on my heart that and I think there's a couple different times with my Gospel with Greg series where there were certain topics that sort of like with the first one where I felt like it needed to be talked about more, but maybe the topic was a little more controversial. Like I did one on how Christians should handle political discussions, since a lot of people can get so bitter about things. Mm-hmm. And that was one of them where I'm like, this needs to be talked about. And I'm sitting there like, feeling so tense. I'm like, I do not want to record this video, mm-hmm. And I felt like I was sort of, putting a target on my head with it.
Yeah.
And, but it was one of those things where I just felt like, no, this needs to be talked about. Mm-hmm. And so, even though, like I said, and I generally love making the videos in the series, but that was kind of one that, I felt, I guess you could say, a little bit of reluctancy with it, but I really felt, God kind of give me that nudge of
like a
talk about this,
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it went all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
So I've heard you talk about your story about your birth. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Oh, not at all. I'd love to. So, like I said, my testimony really starts when I was born. And so my mom kind of had some complications giving birth to me. I was too large for her to have naturally, and that wasn't properly foreseen. And so they really didn't know the full gravity of it until she was already basically giving birth to me. And so emergency measures had to be taken to to deliver me. And I was basically suffocated to death. I was dead for 6 minutes. So by the time they fully delivered me, I was without oxygen and I was black and blue. And so they immediately started CPR on me. And they did that for 6 minutes. And after 6 minutes, they basically gave up on me. My mom, she couldn't see what was going on from where she was laying, but she could tell it wasn't good. And she asked, "How's my baby?" And the doctor looked up at her, and he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "We've done all we can do." And so they're basically like, "He's dead." And I had an aunt who was there, so it was my parents and my aunt was in the room when all this was happening, and my aunt started praying and out loud to where my mom could hear. And at that moment, one of the members of the hospital staff said, "We have a heartbeat." And so God had brought me back to life. And but things were still kind of tough with all that. They moved me to a separate hospital, and it was kind of tough on my dad too, because my mom was in one hospital and recovering from all that, and I was in another, and he was having to go back and forth. And I was put on life support, and I was having some pretty severe seizures. And they told my dad when I was like a day old or so that I probably wouldn't live through the night, and if I did miraculously survive somehow, I would have severe brain damage for the rest of my life. I would never be able to communicate with anyone. I would never be able to learn anything, and the seizures I had been having would never stop. And so understandably, that was very hard for him to hear, but he said, he kept praying, and he didn't accept it. And I ended up surviving. When I was a week old, my parents were able to take me home. I came off the life support. I didn't need it anymore. And they had me dedicated when I was about a month old. And they said that I actually never had another seizure again after I left the hospital. And my mom and dad have told me that over the first few months of after me being born, they could tell that, I wasn't like in a vegetative state, which is basically what they said I would be in, because I was clearly conscious and I could eat and all that. And they kind of had to wait and see, would I have any mental impairments? And they were actually told again when I was a toddler that, well, maybe he doesn't have severe brain damage, but he's going to have, some learning impairments and all that. And my parents got their first kind of peer into what I would be like when I was about a year old. My dad said he was in the kitchen with me one day, and I was sitting in a high chair in front of the TV watching a movie. And this was right around my first birthday. And he said the movie came on, and he was like washing dishes or something. And all of a sudden he heard me say feature presentation. And I had kind of memorized it from watching the movies. And my dad was just shocked, like zipped around, like, what? And so I ended up being able to go to school and everything, and all that. And I've went to college and everything. And it's really amazing because literally everything they said about me when I was born, God pretty much did the opposite. Mm-hmm. They said I died, and they said I wouldn't survive. And, I just turned 27 not too long ago. And they said I'd have seizures my whole life. I haven't had any since I was a week old. They said I would never communicate. Now I'm doing gospel with Greg,
right.
Communicating the gospel with people online. And I'm also an evangelist and go around and preach. They said I would never learn anything. I started college when I was 16. I was able to start a couple years early, and I've gotten a few degrees. I'm working on my PhD now. And I actually, like I said, teach for my job as well. So I thought that, it's really amazing. When I started that, I thought about, they said I would never learn anything myself, and God is using me to teach others. Mm-hmm. And so, and I don't say any of that to try to pat myself on the back, but, because it's all God's power. if I tried to do any of it myself, I would still be dead. So it's only by the grace of God that I've been able to do any of that. And, I like to share my testimony because, I feel like it can be encouraging to people that they're if they feel like they're in impossible circumstances and, in impossible circumstances. And, we all go through times where we feel like, what can I really do and all that. And it's like, if you ever have a question of, can God use me? It's like, well, if he was able to use me, he can use you. I was dead. He found a way to use me. And so he's done a lot for me.
Wow. That is one heck of a story. And let's give praise to your aunt for saying, I'm not giving up on this.
Yeah.
That's amazing right there. She had something in her gut that told her not to quit praying. Do you know how old you were when your parents kind of told you your history?
I don't remember an exact moment where they first kind of set me down and told me, but I was pretty young. I would say by the time I got saved, I knew it, even if I didn't fully comprehend the full weight, that my parents did as adults. But from a pretty young age, I did. And God's continued to work in my life. I actually almost died again as an adult. If you want to hear that story,
I hate these stories because they're, I love them because you're sitting here in front of me, but they're hard, emotionally hard. So yeah, let's go.
Yeah. So, growing up in my first few years of adulthood, I would always, tell people about how God had brought me back to life and everything. And this was about a little less than 3 years ago. So I was 24. There was one day I felt pretty sick, and I just got sicker and sicker, and I thought I just had a stomach virus. But my mom and dad were telling me, you need to go to the hospital and all that. And I'm like, I'm fine. But I got to a point where I could hardly even walk. And I eventually was like, okay, yeah, maybe I need the emergency room. And I went to the ER, and they told me the underlying problem was I had developed appendicitis, but it had actually, the infection, thrown my heart out of rhythm.
Oh, gosh.
And so when I got there and they were examining me, they're basically like, you are on the verge of going into cardiac arrest.
Oh, my gosh.
And I had no clue. And, so they, did what they could. And, of course, they had to remove my appendix because it was going to burst. But they actually had to wait till the next day to take it out because they said, like, we're afraid that your heart's going to give out if we try to operate right now.
Whoa.
And so I thank God that all worked out fine. And I remember laying in my bed recovering from that surgery, thinking about how God spared my life when I was born, and then I almost just died again, and he spared me for that. And I remember laying in my bed thinking, God, I don't know what you're keeping me alive for, but I know it's something great. And the very next month, I preached in church for the first time. And so I've been preaching for about 2 or 3 years now, and it's just amazing to think about. And something I do whenever I do something ministry-wise, like if I'm going to preach somewhere, I'll look at the scars on my stomach from that surgery to remind me that God kept me alive to do what I'm about to do.
That's awesome. And you don't take that for granted. You know you're here. You know you have a purpose.
Yeah.
So you're sitting on a bench with Jesus. You look at him and say what?
Well, that's it's kind of difficult to answer because, he knows everything. So, you could ask him pretty much anything. But honestly, I think that, there might be 100 different things I would bring up. But I think the first thing, honestly, would be just thank him. Thank him for dying for my sins, and thanking him for, all the healings and blessings he's given me in my life. And we can never truly thank him enough. But, I would certainly, I would want to start with that before I asked him anything, to just say thank you so much.
Yeah, because he definitely has done a lot for us that we're undeserving of.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming on to the podcast tonight. And thank you for listening to today's episode. Join us next episode for another encouraging testimony on My Jesus Story podcast.